Hello, welcome to another episode of Tiny Nest. I'm Kiva.
And I'm Jake. This series is following our tiny house project from the early stages through to completion and beyond.
In this episode, we show how we install our ceiling. As you can see, we've made some progress on our ceiling, but a lot has happened to get us to this point. So we'll catch you up on that, and then we'll show you our installation process. Our loft is made out of the same material as our exterior siding, and we painted the bottom of the boards with a solid stain in white to give us this look. We knew we wanted to do something similar for our ceiling, but we didn't want to use the same material because it's so thick. We found this 1/4-inch tongue and groove pine, comes bare, this piece we stained. It comes pre-packaged instead of by the foot, and when we looked into how much we would need for our ceiling, it was a bit too expensive for what we were hoping. We actually considered using some of the same material that we used on our walls for the ceiling, this stuff here. But then we found this product, which is a cabin or cottage grade pine, which means it's just a little bit rougher. It was less money and we actually liked the look of the rougher, so that's what we went with. Because we wanted our ceiling to be the same as the ceiling in our living room, which is the bottom of our loft, we assumed that we would have the rough side of these pieces facing down. Because we were being diligent about sealing everything, we went ahead and slapped bargain bin paint all over the smooth side of these boards. This ended up being a huge mistake because we did all of this before doing any test fitting. And when we did do the test fitting, we realized that the back sides of the boards don't have the chamfer edges, which makes the nice seams in between the boards. And I don't know if you can see in the video, but the bargain paint that we used is like an off-white that's a little bit blue, and it's also a different product than the solid stain that we were going to use. This means that this entire stack was basically ruined. We also found out during our test fit that the quality of the tongue and groove was quite bad, and in some pieces it was basically impossible to get the tongue into the groove. And we also found in some pieces that the tongue was just completely broken off. It's kind of depressing, I can't even look at this.
Since we had to replace all the boards we'd messed up, we had to look at all the packages we'd not yet opened and identified ones that were quite rough, particularly where a lot of tongues were missing. And we took the opportunity to try to exchange them, which we were able to do. And so we inspected all the packages that we came away with on that day and tried to pick the best ones. Both for the ones we exchanged outright and the ones that we had to buy to replace these.
Having gotten new materials, we had to start over and reseal and stain all of our boards. When we went to put the first few pieces up, we thought we could overcome the crappy tongue and groove by affixing the first piece to the ceiling and then hammering the subsequent pieces onto the tongue. We quickly realized that the fit was just too bad and this would be impossible. This also meant that we couldn't nail through the tongues and then hide the nails with the next piece, like we've done with our other tongue and groove stuff. This ended up being the straw that broke the camel's back, because we felt like we were putting so much time into this one task and making no progress. We were already feeling a little bit burned out by the project, so we decided to take a break. We didn't touch the structure at all in November, and then the holidays ate up a lot of December, so it was almost 2 months before we started back at it. With a new energy, we decided to take a fresh look at the problem and decided to use a technique that we used on some of our exterior siding, which was to cut off the backside of the grooves and then simply lay the piece over the previous tongue, line it up by hand, and then face nail it on. The only drawback to this solution was that every single board needed the back groove removed. So we fiddled around with the table saw until we found a setting that took off just that little slice. Then we ran 70 plus boards through. And then we went through and resealed all of the resulting bare wood.
With 8-foot-long pieces and just under 20 feet to span, every row of ceiling boards is going to require multiple joints and thus also a lot of cuts. So we've set up our little chop saw inside the tiny house to avoid having to ferry things back and forth to the garage. And with other tasks like our feature walls and the few times on the exterior siding where we'd have to make joints, we put an effort into trying to make the seam that you see nice and tight. And we do that by cutting the first piece at a certain angle and then making the second cut on the other adjoining piece a slightly different angle such that the front seam would make contact first so we could tighten that up. The back side might have a bit of a gap, but it would ensure that the finished product looked nice and tight. But with this being like a rougher material and we're face nailing and there's gonna be a lot of cuts to deal with, we're just using a fixed 30-degree angle to make every cut and just working with what we've got, and it's looking good enough for the overall look of the ceiling that we're going for here. We're trying to use as many full 8-foot pieces as possible to minimize wastage, but we still need angles on the ends to mate with previous or subsequent pieces. So we're just gonna trim off as little as possible on the ends, just enough to make an angle. I've also got our vacuum hooked up to minimize the amount of dust that gets in here. We found that the saw can chip, especially the tongue, right as the cut is finishing. A blade can catch and pull a chunk of wood off here. And of course, in a seam where two pieces meet, it's really noticeable if there's a big chunk missing on one of the pieces. So we found that putting a little bit of masking tape over where we're gonna cut really helps to prevent that chipping. And so we do this on every cut, regardless of if it's an end cut like this or a cut out in the middle of like cutting a piece in half or whatever.
These pieces are actually slightly less than 8 feet long by about 1/4 inch. And then when we do our angled cuts, that takes them down by about 1/8 to 1/4 inch, which would normally be fine with 16 on-center joists. But we found that we weren't super precise with our framing, and some of the gaps span just slightly more than 8 feet, which makes these pieces just barely too short to span that gap. So we've been measuring every piece, and what we've been doing is things like we'll cut the previous piece a little bit long so that we shift everything forward to make it fit. Just thought we would mention it because it's really easy to overlook something in the framing stages that ends up giving you a bit of a headache in the finishing stages, like this.
When we did the exterior siding, we used a story pole to optimize where all the seams were going to land to help us work around windows and penetrations and all the stuff out there. And we also used that same technique when we did the end walls, which are tongue and groove. But on the ceiling, we didn't bother with that because there's only 2 ceiling boxes in the whole surface. But as luck would have it, we've run into a situation where one row is going to be completely severed by the boxes. And that's fine on this side where there's a joist to nail into right here, so this is nice and solid. But on the other side, there's no wood over here, so this board is going to be loose and flopping, especially because we've been cutting off the back side of the groove. The pieces aren't even like locking together, so this one will be extra loose. The boxes do have these tabs that are meant to stop basically what I was just describing. but they're spaced a 1/2 inch back, basically for like a standard 1/2 inch drywall. But since we knew that our ceiling was going to be thinner than a 1/2 inch, we actually busted the tabs off the side that's against the joist so that we could slide it back, like recess it in. And so now we've got a situation where there's still space for the board to flap. So the solution we've come up with is to just nail on a little scrap to basically thicken, like effectively thicken the board at that spot. So when we put it in place, the scrap there will actually butt up against, or, back against those tabs. And you can see that if I push on it, it actually kind of pushes on the box and everything is more or less held sort of as one unit, as opposed to there being that space for this board to just flap and possibly have a ugly seam or whatever. And obviously we're using the same scrap technique for the other light box here. So once we got our technique down, we basically just plowed ahead and finished it off. So to recap a few details, we used 3/4 inch 18 gauge brad nails, the same stuff we used on the walls, like the wall panels, to affix it. We just used our little nail gun. And I tended to back off the force of the gun so that it would underdrive, like leave a bit of the head sticking out, rather than overdrive and kind of gouge in. And that does mean that I'm gonna have to tap in a bunch of heads, which will be pretty tedious, but it'll help with the finished look being pretty clean, since we did have to sort of make the sacrifice of face nailing because of the problems we had with the tongue and groove and everything. Another challenge we encountered a few times is that the thickness, like this way in the boards, is a bit inconsistent, and we had mixed up all the packs and everything when we were staining. So what would happen is, say this board, we'd nail it right up to the very end, then we'd measure for the next piece, cut it, stain their cut, bring it up, and then find that, bam, it was a different thickness. Not much, but enough that it makes this kind of harsh step, and such that the next row would have this really awful spot to go over, and the seam just wouldn't be very good. So the solution for that we came up with was to just stop nailing at the previous joists and leave the end kind of free. And then when our next piece came up, we'd put them together, see if one was a different thickness, and then just put some pressure to flex it and sort of split the difference and line the seams up as best we could, and then nail it in that position, and then carry on from there. And that worked out pretty well, such that we could basically mate any piece with any other piece regardless if there was a difference in the thickness. Another thing we started doing is just taking a full piece and just kind of slapping it up in the middle, not starting on one wall or the other. And that solved the issue that we had described earlier, where we were like some of the joist space are not perfectly 8 feet, and we'd have to like account for that. So this way we would just hold the full piece up, make sure that it was in a good position, and then just nail it into place. And then all we'd have to do is measure from one end to one wall and the other end to the other wall, make those cuts, and just stick those pieces in. And because the boards are quite thin and flexy, we could just sneak them in even though it's pretty tight against the wall. And the last thing I'll mention is that when we got to the end, we found that we had about 1.5 inch gap between the last row and the wall. And because we're gonna be using some pretty thin trim, we decided to cut like a 3/4 inch strip and make a little mini row as the last thing, just to make sure that there's some backing tight enough to the wall that the trim will have something to back against.
We're finally done the ceiling. Felt like it took us forever, and we're really excited to move on to the next part of the project. If you want to see some of our previous videos, click on the preview tiles. And subscribe if you want to follow our progress. You can also visit our website here.
tongues were missing. And we took the opportunity to... Oh...
Having got... Are grinning back there?
Was I smiling?
A concerned Ben, he doesn't like swear words. He does not like them. He does not like them. Oh! The bunch!
The thing is, buddy, so funny. Is it a weird shot? Okay, you ready?
Finish the fucking story, man.